Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, January 6th, and Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me again. And I don't know if I had the opportunity to say Happy New Year to everybody. And if not, I do for you, your family, and all those who look at our program.
To you too. And let's get started, Colonel, with what's going on between Hezbollah and Israel. Right now, it seems that the situation is getting much more serious in the eyes of Hezbollah because they have received some sort of pressure from the Lebanese government to go along with the plan of ceasefire, temporary ceasefire. Right now, it seems that the situation in southern Lebanon is getting that much serious that even the Hezbollah said that they may deal with Israeli invasion or occupation in the southern Lebanon before 60 days. And they're totally prepared. They could restore everything that they've lost, and they're totally prepared to fight Israel.
Well, the problem is that since the ceasefire agreement was signed, Israel has never abidden by this agreement. It didn't respect this agreement. In fact, distractions have continued. Israeli forces have continued to proceed deeper inside Israeli territory. And as I could read a couple of days ago, that Israel was ready to maintain its presence in Lebanon beyond the 60 days presence. So we have this peculiar situation, which was in fact predictable, that Israel would not respect the ceasefire agreement. It never respected the agreement. And again, I am confident they will not respect the agreement. Now, the problem in Lebanon is a more complex one because, as you know, this ceasefire agreement is based on the resolution 1701 that, in fact, asks for disbanding all the armored factions within Lebanon and their replacement by the Lebanese armored forces. And we have to go a little bit deeper on that because Israel used this resolution 1701 to refuse to apply the subsequent resolutions. Resolution 1701 was adopted in 2006 after the invasion or the attack of Israel. And this resolution 1701 is itself is based on the so-called Taif agreement that was passed among Lebanese factions in 1979. And probably we have to start from this point because at that point, it was agreed by all Lebanese factions that they would disband and transfer their authority to the Lebanese armed forces. Now, in 1979, Hezbollah didn't exist. Hezbollah exists since 1985, and but of course, it received all it has to abide by the same agreement than the predecessor organization like the Islamic jihadi Islamic movement and things like this that existed before the Hezbollah. In any case, the thing is that this Taif agreement wants to restore the sovereignty and the authority of the Lebanese government on the whole Lebanese territory. Problem is that Lebanese forces have never been in a position to have the power, the firepower, and the ability to take over from, and in that case, the Hezbollah. But there is a clause into the Taif agreement that justify the reason why Hezbollah is still in existence. The clause is that before the all the factions in Lebanon should give back their, or lay down their weapons, is the departure of Israel from the territory. And in fact, Israel has never left the territory of Lebanon. Of course, today you had this the offensive of last October, things like this in Lebanon. But even before that, Israel has never left Lebanon. It still keeps a number of very small territories along the border. Even the border has been set by Israel, disregarding the existing law and existing borders that were defined by the French before. And therefore, in fact, Israel remains an occupying power, thus legitimizing the Hezbollah presence and the Hezbollah existence even. And after 2006, it was the idea that the Lebanese forces would take over. And that's why, for instance, the UNIFIL, the UN force in Lebanon, is called an interim force. It's an interim force. It's not an interposition force. As many people understand, seem to understand, that the UN is here on the separation line between Israel and Lebanon. It's wrong. The UNIFIL is there in order to avoid a power void, if you want, in the South Lebanon. And the idea is that the UNIFIL would stay there until Lebanese forces are in a position to take over and to restore the full sovereignty of Lebanon in this region. But again, Lebanese forces have never been in position to do so, and therefore the Hezbollah remains the only force in Lebanon that is able to maintain Lebanese sovereignty over the southern part of Lebanon. And that's the reason why the Israeli says, well, Resolution 1701 calls for the disbandment of Hezbollah, but at the same time, never never an attempt to empower the Lebanese forces to be able taking over the position that Hezbollah is taking. In addition to that, Israel never managed its way out of Lebanon, thus legitimizing the presence of Hezbollah, thus making Resolution 1701 kind of a plan for the future, if you want. And so we are now in this situation that as Israel is playing with words by saying that Hezbollah should be disbanded, and since it's not disbanded, then Israel is legitimized to be there, because Israel doesn't recognize that it occupies Lebanese territory. Because for Israel, Lebanese territory is Israeli territory, and therefore they are not occupying the territory. And that's where we have this very awkward situation with Israel and its neighbors, that Israel never managed, since 1948, it never managed to define clearly its borders. And why didn't define this? Because Israel has still the doctrine of occupying the so-called Greater Israel, that in theory, based on theological beliefs, this is the Greater Israel should extend from the Nile to the Euphrates, and including a part of Syria and a part of Lebanon. And that was, in fact, that was recalled recently by Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister of Israel, who said that South Lebanon is part of Israel. So, from the Israeli side, they feel that they are not occupying any country, they are at home, while others, and so they are legitimizing the presence of others, but they don't recognize this legitimation because for them, everything is Israel. So we are in this kind of it's a vicious circle, an intellectual vicious circle that Israel is promoting, that creates the condition for a permanent state of war in the region. And that's exactly what the Syrian, including the new Syrian authorities, are experiencing in Syria, because the Israeli don't feel that the Golan is an occupied territory. For them, it's their territory. And that applies also to all these territories up to Damascus. And again, Smotrich recently said that Damascus should belong to Israel, period. So we are in here with, again, back to the same point, that Israel, by refusing to abide by international law, is creating a situation of perpetual war with all its neighbors. And that must be clear, because even Jordan, for instance, is not considered as by Israel as an independent thing. It's an occupied territory for Israel, because Israel still claims that this part of that used to be Transjordan, it was part of the mandatory Palestine in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And the 20s, because Transjordan was given to the Hashemite tribe and became Jordan in the late 20s. But before that, Transjordan belonged to the mandatory Palestine. And Israel, and particularly the branch of the Likud party, of which you have Benjamin Netanyahu, never recognized the fact that the British gave this territory to the Hashemite. As a result, Israelis, and especially the Israeli right, the Likud in particular, still claims that this part of the Near East should be part of Israel. So we are in a kind of mindset that we will have endless wars in the region. And again, the United Nations several times requested from Israel to define clearly its borders, so that we know exactly where we stand as to what is the ultimate extension of Israel. But Israel has systematically and consistently refused to define its borders. So we are in a situation that Israel will continue to expand, because that's part of their ideology, that's part of their philosophy, and that's part of the legal system to some extent. So we have here a situation, and what's happening in in the Palestinian occupied territory, by the way, but also in southern Lebanon, is only the illustration of this very strange, because Israel is the only country in the world that has never defined its borders. And this is this peculiar situation that in fact make this situation impossible for all the neighbors of Israel. But there's a catch on that, because that works as long as Israel is strong enough to resist pressure from outside. But since it has no border, that means that the rest of the Near East could claim that territory. You see? If you have no border, basically, we could say you have no existence. And that's a paradox, because Israel wants to be recognized, especially from the Palestinians. They want their existence to be recognized. But at the same time, by not defining their borders, they make this recognition impossible from others. Because when you recognize Israel as a neighbor, if you are in Europe, this probably doesn't play much role. But when you are in the Middle East, if you are a neighbor of Israel, if you recognize Israel, you may well recognize at one point that Israel is your territory, since the borders have not been defined. By recognizing Israel, you give some kind of blank check for the Israeli authorities to extend wherever they want. And that's the reason why it makes impossible for the Palestinians to effectively recognize Israel, because we don't know up to which limit does Israel exist or extends. And that this is this kind of a catch-22 issue that we have with Israel. Again, that might be a problem in the future, because and the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham are questioning, in fact, the presence of Israel on Syrian territory, and they may wish at one point to physically come and help the Palestinians. We are probably not so far at this stage, and there are still a lot of pressure from the United States to avoid this. But potentially, we have here an issue that needs to be considered. And I think Israel is so overconfident that it will receive the support of the rest of the world that it can play with that. But in reality, the West and Israel are in fact creating the seeds of further wars and further disturbance in the region by not constraining Israel to define its borders. So we are here in a very, very peculiar situation, in fact. But it's not new. That is since the late 40s. This is the situation. The problem is that slowly, because of this new government, because we have more and more, it seems, governments in Israel that are less and less rational, that are more and more, let's say, ideologically or religiously motivated, that we may end. I mean, Israel is becoming some kind of ISIS, Jewish version, if you want. And that can create a problem for the whole of the world, in fact, because it's a kind of nihilistic type of philosophy that is currently developed by the current government of Israel. And there is no sign that there will be an appeasement on that, because the population is not adverse to that. Even if they don't like Netanyahu, they are not adverse to the situation, this kind of situation. You may have some intellectuals and scholars and academics who oppose that, and you have them on the international alternative media and so on. But a large part of the population is, in fact, in tune with this theological or religious extremist approach to Israel. So I don't know. I have a lot of question marks at this stage, but definitely this is the state of the situation today.
Colonel, when you look at the Israeli army today and the way that they're trying to capture some land in southern Lebanon, and we know they are in southern Syria as well. And it seems to me, for the size of the army, it's overstretching their army right now. And how capable is Israel? It's at the end of the day, it seems that they're believing the United States is behind them, is supporting them to whatever extent they have in their mind. But is that a reality? Are they going to be, because the army is not capable of sustaining the situation? This is the main question right now. Are they going to be able to continue this way?
Well, they will be able. Sorry, they will be able to continue this way as long as the neighbors allow that. You know, we have seen since almost 2 years, I mean, 1 year and a half now, that even a very tiny uh, Palestinian force is able to, in fact, counter the very mighty and powerful Israeli army in Gaza. We have seen that the Hezbollah is also in a position to contain, to some extent, the ambitions of Israel. But what about Jordan? What about Syria today? What about Egypt? You know, as long as those countries do not have the willingness to fight, then of course you may consider that Israel is overstretched. But at the same time, if they don't have an enemy, then it's not a it's they are stretched, but probably not overstretched. You see, the thing is that if for some reason we have a change in the policy of the others, these neighbors like Jordan, Egypt, and others, or Syria, if we have change in the policy of this, if by some if they want to join their forces against Israel, then Israel would have certainly a very hard time. Problem is, again, that all these countries, take Egypt, take Jordan, and probably even Syria today, they're so dependent on the Western financing, the support from the West, that they cannot afford to join their forces to repel Israel. In my view, it would be a healthy situation if all these countries would join their forces and constrain Israel to maintain and to keep into their border, and probably even constrain Israel to define its borders. The problem is that nobody is in a position today to do so, and we don't see the willingness among these Near East countries to join their forces against Israel. So this is a little bit the problem. Now, we have also to say that the Jordan army, for instance, is not a very powerful army. It has never been, and it's will probably not be in the future. The Egyptian army it could be a strong army, but at the same time, we don't see the Egyptian government has make every effort to be aligned on the West, and we will probably have the same thing with the new authorities in Syria. We have seen that first of all, we have to remember that it's still a terrorist movement. The Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is still considered as a terrorist movement, meaning that The West can play with that in the sense that they can say, okay, we tolerate your existence as long as you do what we want you to do. But if you change your mind, if you start to have kind of independent policy, then we'll start to implement the fact that you are a terrorist organization and will destroy you. This is a little bit this kind of extremely ambiguous position of the Western countries towards the HES. It's a little bit like we had a similar example in. That reminds me, sorry to jump to different areas, but in during Second World War, you had the General Rokossovsky. It used to be, or it became, one of the most successful general of the Soviet Union in fighting against the German, and in fact he led the Soviet army to Berlin in 1945. But this guy, in fact, used to be in prison until 1941. It has been jailed in 1937 and condemned to death. And in 1941, after the defeat or the retreat of the Soviet army after the Barbarossa operation, Stalin took this general out of jail and told him, okay, now you have an opportunity to save your life. So please head my armies against the Germans. And he didn't remove the death penalty over Rokossovsky. And Rokossovsky led the Soviet army up to the 1945, and it became, because he used to be half Polish and half Russian, he eventually became the Ministry of Defense of Poland, but it still had the death penalty on him, meaning that the Soviets could still steer him as they wanted because the death penalty had not been removed. And we have exactly the same situation today with the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. We keep some kind of death penalty over the guy. So now you do as we want. And if you don't, then that will be bad for you. So, meaning that you have now, of course, you have the Turks who have expressed their intent to support physically the Palestinians. I'm not sure this goes beyond rhetoric, by the way, but okay. And we know that the Syrian government, the current Syrian government, asks the Security Council, the UN Security Council, to ask Israel to remove its troops from the Syrian territory. But whether it will go beyond that, I'm not sure, because the West has so much capabilities of pressuring the Syrian government that, in fact, this Syrian government cannot really act independently because of that. So we are now in this situation. So meaning that Israel, in fact, is stretched, probably not completely overstretched at this stage, but is stretched, but it is not threatened by, in fact, anybody. The only forces that are threatening Israel are obviously the Palestinians, especially in the Gaza Strip, the Hezbollah in the north, and the Houthis from Yemen, and that's it. So we have, yes, they are stretched, but not to that point. There are other challenges, and the Houthis have obviously discovered that with their hypersonic missiles, the Philistine 2 missile, they can still go through the Israeli air defense. So this high-tech air defense system of Israel is obviously not waterproof. Um, so Israel is under pressure, obviously, but as long as the West can maintain control over what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Jordan and in Egypt, basically Israel can afford to not respecting the international law.
Colonel, everybody sees the situation in Syria as a breaking point, as something so crucial between the Shia and Sunni. But do you see the possibility of the situation getting totally different in terms of the difference between Iran and Turkey in a long run? Do you see that they can get along with each other in terms of what's going on in Syria? Maybe would be a greater challenge than Houthis or other parties in the conflict with Israel.
Well, there are two factors that we have to consider. The first one is that because of the behavior of Israel since October 2023, we see that this is a kind of, let's say, consensus in the region that Israel is a problem. And that, in fact, explains probably also why we have this rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And we have also those ties between Iran and Turkey, by the way. That's one aspect. The second aspect is nothing directly related to that, but is related to the overall geopolitical situation that has developed since the last 3 years. This is the sense that the the West is no longer has no longer the credibility that it used to have, and that the rest of the world needs to join their forces in order to look at the future. The West doesn't belong to the future of the rest of the world. You see, they don't see the West as part of the future for the rest of the world. They have realized that they can afford to be independent from the West. They realize that they need to work together towards a better future, and they have discovered the virtues of diplomacy in developing joint opportunities under the auspices of China, obviously, because in order to have the rest of the world getting some independence from the West, you needed to have kind of a locomotive, an industrial, technological, and economic locomotive. And this locomotive is the China. The same locomotive that the West used to have after World War II, in fact, with the US. The US used to be the locomotive of the West, but now it's fading. And now you have this new locomotive that has emerged, China, and probably later we'll have that with India. But we definitely have this Asian locomotive that is emerging. And therefore, you have now the sense that the rest of the world has can be independent from the West in terms of political decision, foreign policy, diplomatic efforts, and the international cooperation and things like this. And these are the new factors that will impact the situation in the Near East. Now, clearly, what happened in December with the collapse of the Bashar al-Assad government, with in fact, this kind of de facto recognition of the split of Syria, where even if we don't know exactly where this will lead to, but we see that Syria is split, that the Shiite croissant has been also split, in fact, to some extent. But these might be just tactical aspects, or let's say short-term aspects, because my feeling is that the rest of the world has understood that it can overcome this kind of difficulties. It can overcome this kind of divisions. We need probably to reshape. And again, we have to remember that Syria, I mean, the map of the Near East that we had until last year, this map is in fact the map that was created after the fall of the Ottoman Empire 100 years ago. So now we have obviously an adjustment to that. And in fact, it's even a miracle that the map that we knew before has lasted so long, because in the past we had the map, especially in the region, has changed very often. So now we'll have this readjustment. But this readjustment might not be the end of the times. It might be the opportunity of readjusting also other aspects of the region. So nothing is cast in stone. We have this idea, sorry, but this idea in the West, especially in Europe, because after World War II, we said we will not change the borders. This kind of this idea that the border should not be touched anymore. But the rest of the world is not exactly in this situation, because sorry about that. I have to drink a little bit. The rest of the world, in fact, knows that the borders they were defined in the 20th century were in fact the result of policies dating back from the 19th century. And on the whole geography of Africa, for instance, but also the Middle East, all this geography is only the result of the policies of the late 19th century, early 20th century, and in particular the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So they need to be an adjustment of that. And also to reestablish probably the realities on the ground of the ethnic pattern of certain regions. So I don't know. I would have preferred to keep the borders as they were, but I don't see the changes as a catastrophe, and I don't see these changes as a potential problem for the future. It can be an opportunity also for the future. This may not affect countries like, for instance, Iran, your country that used to have the same border since the late 18th century. It's one of the few countries, in fact, of the region that has kept exactly the same borders since more than 200 years. Now, but the rest, all the other countries, including Saudi Arabia, we mentioned Jordan, all these countries, in fact, are rather new in terms of borders. And meaning that there's a constant change. And probably if this is managed properly, if it's done with the idea of a search for balance, for regional balance and justice, we can assume that this could be an opportunity for many countries and ethnic groups of the region. I don't know. Again, this is up to these countries to to do so. But at the same time, this could be also an opportunity and probably something Israel should be worried about, because by behaving badly, since it has done since 1948, of course, the Israel is thought to concentrate all the hate that we may have, not just in the region, by the way, but also outside of the region. And we see more and more countries that have this, that try to distantiate themselves from Israel, to have less uh, economic relations with Israel. Some have cut even diplomatic ties with Israel and all that. So, meaning that if the pattern of the region changes, if somehow countries decide at one point that Israel needs to be disciplined and brought back in line with international order, then Israel may not have as much support as it may want to. Uh, Look even at the United States, which is obviously considered as the potential strongest supporter of Israel. At the same time, we know today that a factor that was decisive in giving the victory to Trump versus Kamala Harris is the policy of the Democrats towards Israel. So, meaning that even in a country that has the reputation of being an unconditional supporter of Israel, even in this country, you have a lot of people, and probably even a majority of people, who realize that Israel is probably not the best partner you can have. And therefore, it they probably don't want the Israel to disappear, but they probably want to have an Israel that behave like a normal country, that behave like a country that has pledged in 1949 to abide by international law, by the rules of the United Nations, and that behave properly, that has a moral army and not an army which is alleged to be the most moral army in the world, but that behave properly, that stops killing medical personnel, journalists, children, and so on and so forth, that stops using torture, that stops infringing the rights of the population it is supposed to protect, and so on and so forth. So, probably we may have this evolution. And in fact, I hope that we have this evolution, that you have enough pressure that can build in the region to coerce Israel to behave properly. I'm not saying that they should promote the disparagement of Israel. This is not what I'm saying, but they should promote an Israel that behave like a normal country, that be a country that behaves according to the rules and laws of the international law and the rules of the United Nations. So that's what I hope it can emerge from this kind of a moving jigsaw puzzle that we are seeing today. And again, I don't have a crystal ball, but I would say that this changing pattern of the map of the Middle East could be the opportunity for having that.
Colonel, it seems that right now in Israel, the idea of attacking Iran is so popular. And in the United States, those part of the media that are closer to Donald Trump are talking about that Israel was successful in destroying Iran's air defense system, and Iran is now much more vulnerable to any sort of attack coming from Israel. Here comes the question: how they can imagine a country with the size of Israel can fight Iran? Because at the end of the day, there has to be some sort of balance between these forces. I don't see Israel that capable of attacking Iran or fighting, because the foreign minister of Iran was asked about if Israel attacks Iran. He said the consequence of this attack would be a large war between Iran and Israel. And even with the United States backing Israel, they're not in the we've seen the war in Ukraine, and even it's the European countries are just so close to Ukraine, they can support Ukraine, they can do whatever they want. But the situation with Iran and Middle East is totally different from what we've seen so far in Ukraine. How do you see this idea on the part of Israelis attacking Iran and bringing up a larger war, a big war between Iran and Israel? And how can they imagine that they can survive such a war with Iran?
Well, this kind of situation that we can define as irrational. Um, and again, that could be related. It's kind of a messianic, nihilistic understanding of the existence of Israel, which is a source of concern, obviously. And that this kind of messianic understanding is also shared by some US politicians. But if we see the reality on the ground. First of all, you remember that recently the minister Shoigu, the ex-Russian Minister of Defense, currently head of the Security Council, the Russian National Security Council, went to Iran to sign a first agreement of military cooperation. Apparently, this agreement will be complemented by another agreement that will probably be signed on the very day or just the day before the inauguration of Donald Trump, which is a global partnership, a strategic partnership agreement between Russia and Iran, which obviously will have as we don't know exactly the terms of this agreement, but we can assume that it will extend the military cooperation between the two countries, and in particular provide or let's say allow Russia to provide more high-tech weaponry to Iran. Apparently, Iran just received the Sukhoi 35. These are state-of-the-art fighters, and others are apparently to follow, meaning that the Russians are clear that they don't want a change in the region that extends to Iran. And Iranians and Russians have understood the threat that is created by both United States and Israel, because apparently there were some discussions in the Biden administration in the recent months, probably in this early December or so, that to strike Iran. So there is still this kind of irrational perception of things in the US, and both Iranians and Russians are conscious of that. And this is probably the reason why they want to have this strategic partnership agreement signed in early this month. Later this month, sorry. Meaning that the challenge of attacking Iran may have more implications than simply a bilateral issue between Iran and Israel. Now, The thing is that the US, and we have seen the inability of the US to, as you rightly pointed out, the inability of the US to support Ukraine in this in its war against Russia. And I think, despite everything we say in Europe, I think the Americans have really not been able to provide a lot of support to. They have provided a lot of military support quantitatively, and if you just count the number of billions, it's a lot of equipment. But in terms of qualitative issues, the support, the doctrinal support, the military support, the training, and things like this, we see that the Ukrainians have never been in a position to challenge the Russians. They have more equipment, yes. They have a constant a supply of equipment that comes on the battlefield, but we see that the integration of this equipment into a solid and consistent doctrinal principles, this is missing, and the US has not been able to do so. And we may have the same thing with Israel. So we may have a lot of equipment supplied to Israel and kind of air airlift between the US and Israel, as we had in 1973, to provide a lot of equipment and material support to Israel. But more than this, I'm not sure they will be able to do so. And that means that launching a war against Iran is a very dangerous gamble. And I am not sure. I mean, probably the Israelis don't see that because they are so, let's say, ideologically and emotionally driven that they probably don't see the implications. The Americans probably see that better, a little bit better, but the ones who see that certainly very well are the Russians. And they see that if we have such a war, it will probably not be in favor of Israel. Now, the whole issue of this conflict between Israel and Iran is definitely basically an American problem, because if you look rationally, if you try to explain why you have Iran against Israel, you find no rational explanation for that. I mean, there is no territorial claims from neither part. They are not bordering countries, so they are not disturbing each other, if you want. You don't have one that creates a problem for the other. So it's a totally ideological stance. And the thing is that Israel needed to have an enemy in the region and needed to have an enemy that would be worth the engagement of the US. That's why Israel maintained Iran as an enemy, because the US is intellectually and morally unable to set the record with Iran. There is still an idea. The Americans have never swallowed their defeat in 1978 when the Shah had to leave the country. The US never swallowed this. First of all, because they were never able to anticipate this, and they were not able to prevent this. As a result, Ayatollah Khomeini came back into power as as the US was surprised and could not act. And they never swallowed this. And that's the reason, in addition to that, you had the incident of the US embassy and the hostages in the embassy and all that affected definitely the relationship between the two. But after something like 50 years, we could assume that this problem could have been solved. But it didn't, because in the US, you still have those warmongers that keep this kind of conflict alive. And Israel has understood that because they need to have a pawn in the region. You know, this is exactly the same thing as the US forces that are still based in Germany. They are here as a guarantee that the US would fulfill its obligation in the framework of NATO. That's the reason why you have US forces in Germany. They are occupation forces in a certain sense, but the real reason for that is that it's a pawn for the case of Germany being attacked that the US would intervene. Otherwise, if you didn't have those forces, US could say, well, if you have a problem in Europe, that's your problem, and we are just, as it was in 1940, for instance, the US says we are neutral, we don't want to be involved. And until December 1941, that was the position of the US. They wanted to remain neutral in the conflict. And the presence of the US, in fact, prevents this, let's say, the temptation for the US to become neutral. And that's the reason for the US presence in Europe. And for the same reason, or for the same logic, the Israelis took over Iran as enemy exactly as the US, because for them, this is the rationale for having the US being involved in the region. Because the Israel understands that too small, and probably there might be other regional interests that may, at the end of the day, make the US think about the whether it was opportune or not to help Israel. But now, with Iran as the major enemy of Israel, that's the reason why Israel is still maintaining, not just in Israel, but you have in the US, these Israeli or Zionist lobbies still maintain Iran as the main enemy of the US, so that there is something at stake for the US in the region. So we have an artificial uh, conflict between Israel and Iran, because there is no objective reasons for the Iranians to fight against Israel. I mean, Israel is not. I mean, Iran has never considered Israel as an enemy, in fact, but Israel wants to have Iran as an enemy. That's the logic, and that's why the whole issue of Israel, it's to some extent it's very insane, because we have an artificial situation created by Israel to have this kind of enduring tensions in the region. Israel has created those tensions. And if the Middle East is as it is today, with all the tensions, all the problems, it's because Israel wants to have that, because they see that this tension is, if something happens, this is the only guarantee that the US will intervene. And in fact, I mean, everybody now understands that the rationale for the US to intervene in Iraq, it was based on the requests of Israel, in fact. So Israel has never been, and that's a little bit sad to say, but Israel has never been a factor of stability in the region. It's a country that's never managed, through diplomacy, for instance, through foreign policy, to improve the situation in the region. It has always been a factor of division, not a factor of union. And it's interesting to see that you don't have, in fact, an Israeli foreign policy, or let's say a diplomacy, better said. They don't have a diplomacy, and they don't have a diplomacy that is active, apparent, with a result of a search of stability in the region. The diplomacy of Israel is just here to justify its aggressive stance against its neighbors. It's not there trying to solve problems. It's just here to explain why Israel is obliged to have problems with its neighbors. So it's a little bit a pity that Western countries that consider themselves close intellectually, historically close to Israel, never managed to discuss this matter with Israel and try to, let's say, suggest Israel to have a more, let's say, accommodating stance towards the world it is into. Again, this is everything has roots in history. Remember that not a single square meter of Israel has been, in fact, given to Israel. Every single square meter Israel is occupying, even not just the Palestinian territory, every single square meter has been taken by force by Israel. And that was not the essence of what the West wanted to have. They wanted to have a peaceful, democratic, referendum-based emergence of Israel in Palestine. And Israel never managed to do it. As a result, Israel, since 1947, in fact, is in search of imposing itself to the rest of the region. And imposing itself means that it has to be imposed by force. And it never realized that the most durable, the most effective, and probably the most constructive way of having a durable presence in the region would be to have to try to have a diplomatic approach to establish and solidify its presence in the region. But that requires that you cannot have a religiously motivated approach or nihilistic or messianic approach to the Israeli presence in the region. You have to abandon the idea of a greater Israel, for instance, and all that. But Israel has never managed to go so far, despite the efforts of some, as I said before, intellectuals, academics, and things like this, that you may have in Israel and outside Israel, by the way, because you have a lot of people who understand that quite well outside of Israel. But Israel never managed to integrate this kind of thinking into their domestic policies and their foreign policy and the national security policy in that respect. So we have here a situation that, in my view, and probably the changes that we have observed in Syria should give the opportunity to the West to have very serious discussion with Israel and to incitate Israel to have a more law-abiding approach to their foreign policy, because otherwise, I have said that many times, and you have more and more people who are mentioning that, is that we are probably close to the point where Israel will have to disappear, because simply the rest of the region will not accept anymore the kind of violations, the constant violation of international law that Israel can allow itself.
As you mentioned, Colonel, one of the main reasons for this comprehensive agreement between Iran and Russia is what's going on in Ukraine. And talking about what's going on in Ukraine and Trump's policy in Ukraine, going from 24 hours to put an end to the conflict, and right now Keith Kellogg talking about freezing the conflict, the battleground, and maybe postponing Ukraine's accession to NATO for 20, 30 years, which is not acceptable for Russia. And it seems that Ukrainians right now are talking about they can negotiate with Russia, but at the end of the day, there has to be some sort of guarantee on the part of the United States to join NATO, which we know it doesn't make sense for the whole conflict. It's about NATO.
Well, the whole conflict. I mean, the very basis of the whole conflict, not the Russian intervention in 2042, but the whole conflict. I mean, what happened since, in fact, 2008. The background of this is NATO. And we know, as I have said many times, Alexei Arestovich, the then advisor of Zelensky, explained that they had to provoke a war with Russia in order to defeat Russia. And based on that defeat, then Ukraine could access a membership into NATO. The problem is that things didn't happen as planned, and that Russia could not be defeated by the massive and brutal sanctions that were applied on it. And therefore, we are now in the situation where we are. The thing is that the Russians have stated very clearly what is the baseline to enter negotiation. And again, it's important to remember that. It's the baseline to enter negotiation. It's not the aim of the negotiation. It's the baseline to enter negotiation. And this baseline is twofold. And that's what Vladimir Putin said on the 14th of June 2024 at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia. This twofold. First is that all the four oblasts of the south and east of Ukraine, namely Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk, should be free of Ukrainian forces. I mean, these four oblasts should be under the authority of Russia. Point one. The second point is that Ukraine will not be member of NATO, period. Not in 2 years, not in 5 years, not in 10 years, not in 20, not in 30 years, not member of NATO, period. That's the baseline to start negotiations. So everything you have and everything that we are extracting from this kind of document or non-paper that was written by Kellogg and one of his colleagues in spring last year, that mentioned the possibility of freezing the conflict, having peacekeepers or things like that. All that is basically off the table. Period. So the problem I see today is that all the discussions we are witnessing in the West, in fact, are discussions that doesn't take into account the baseline element that was defined by the Russians. Basically, we try to elaborate kind of plans or things like this without any consideration from what the Russians actually want. And remember, if Russia was on the verge of being defeated, then probably we could come up with those ideas. The problem is that what we are witnessing today is exactly the opposite, that Russia is clearly winning. And the question is not whether or not Ukraine will be defeated, but the question is how and when Ukraine will be defeated. And the when is, in fact, defined by the fact that the more help and the more delay we put into a negotiation, the more Ukraine will be destructed or destroyed. Sorry. So we see that, and as Viktor Orban recently said, there are only two ways this conflict will end. One is the destruction of one of the parties, and obviously we are talking about Ukraine at this stage, or a negotiations. And the Europeans don't want to have a negotiations. They oppose the negotiations. Trump is willing to negotiate, but we don't know exactly on which basis. As a result, I'm not sure that Trump will be able to solve the problem within 24 hours, unless he decides that he will negotiate or talk to the Russians based on Russian terms. So this is still an unknown here. But the fact of the matter is that Trump has as a first priority to get the US out of this conflict, not to solve the conflict. That's important because the US allies in Europe, and you take the European Union, you take France, Germany, and all that, they don't want to stop the conflict. They want to continue the conflict. The problem is that they don't know. They don't even know up to which point. And they don't know what could be defined as a victory, what could be defined as a defeat for Ukraine, what could be defined as a defeat for Russia. So, meaning that we have a bunch of politicians who don't know what they want to achieve in reality. They just want to harm Russia, or better said, they want to harm Vladimir Putin. That's all. So there is absolutely no indication whatsoever that says where they want to go. It's just harming people, period. So that means that we don't know exactly where we want to go, and as a result, that means that the price of all this is paid by Ukraine, meaning that Ukraine will likely to be destroyed to some extent. The military force of Ukraine. And when Zelensky talks about negotiation, you said Ukraine is willing to negotiate. It's not exactly true. They use the word negotiation, but the word negotiation for them, again, they always talk about the just peace and things like this, because for Zelensky, negotiation should end up with all Russian forces leaving Ukraine. But how come will they be able to exert enough pressure on Russia to remove all the troops from Ukraine? That's the reason why they just launched this so-called counteroffensive in Kursk just yesterday. An additional counteroffensive. We don't really know where this can lead to, because obviously we are talking about very small scale counteroffensive. You have huge words, but behind the words, we are talking about tactical realities that are extremely limited, and we don't know exactly what they want to achieve with that. But they might gain a few square kilometers, but I'm not sure they will be able to achieve a success in a size that will force Russia to change its plan and to change the course of action of the Russian forces. So we are in a situation where Russia progresses in the Donbass, in Ukraine, very steadily, slowly but steadily. The name of the game for the Russians is not to gain territory. It has never been to gain territory. It is to destroy the military potential of Ukraine, with the idea that initially it was to protect the population of Donbass and the population of, I mean, the Russian population of Ukraine, the so called population of the Novorossiya, as Vladimir Putin said very recently at the Congress of the United Russia Party. This was to protect the population of Donbass and Novorossiya. And and therefore the idea Russia is gaining territory just by destroying forces. Period. It the aim is to destroy forces, not to gain territory. That's why Russia is not in a hurry. As long as Ukraine is providing troops, as long as the West is pushing or pressing Ukraine to provide troops. And again, we can see that the White House recently asked Ukraine to extend recruitment age to 18 years of age, meaning that Russia is saying, okay, do that, continue to do that, because the more people we have, the more potential we destroy. And this is the name of the game for us. This is exactly what General Surovikin used to say on the 18th of October 2022, where he said, our aim as of today is no longer to have big operations on the ground, but to preserve our troops and to destroy systematically and consistently all the force of Ukraine that are proceeding. That's exactly what they are doing. It's not to gain territory, it's to destroy a potential. And the West doesn't want to understand that. That's the reason why they press Ukraine to push more soldiers on the battlefield. And by doing so, they are simply accelerating the process of the destruction of Ukraine. So we are in a situation where the West doesn't want to understand what the Russians want since 2014, because we have here continuity since then. The West doesn't want to listen, and therefore it is sacrificing the Ukrainian people, and the Ukrainians are understanding that very slowly. But again, they accept that, so let's be it. So this is the way it is.
When you look at Europe today, and we had Sikorsky bragging about how Ukraine is capable of cutting off the Russian gas from the European countries and sending to Slovakia and other countries. What does it mean, Europe? Who is Europe today? And is the Trump's presidency going to just accelerate this process of, I would say, self-destructive process for European Union and European countries? Or are they going to come to some sort of sanity within this process that is happening right now? And they may change their attitude and they may find a more independent position in the world.
Well, First of all, we have to remember that Donald Trump was elected to make America great again, not to make Europe great again. That's the first point. Meaning that the idea of Donald Trump is to rebuild the industrial fabrics of the continental US. And that's exactly what he said, that he would recreate jobs in the US. He even said that he would steal jobs from outside to recreate these industrial fabrics in the United States. And that will happen at the expense of European industrial fabrics. This must be clear. So the European will certainly not benefit from the Donald Trump's initiative, or let's say policy. That's the first aspect. The second is that within Europe, we are seeing more and more governments that are collapsing. I mean, we have seen that in France. We have that seen in very recently in Germany. We have seen that in the UK. We have seen that in various Austria very recently, and we have the collapse of all the traditional parties and the emergence of new parties who are probably more conscious of what is at stake for Europe and probably what is at stake in the interests, not simply of Europe, but what is at stake, or what is in the interest of the European population. And that's why you have those so-called populist parties like AfD in Germany, but you have similar, the pendant of this in Germany is the party of Sarah Wagenknecht, which is the leftist pendant of that. And you have the same thing in France. You have left extreme, I mean, populist, leftist populist and rightist populist that tend to emerge. Even though in France, even those populist movements are much more embedded into the system than they are in Germany. And that also explains why you have in Germany these temptations to forbid or to ban parties like the AfD, which is quite odd for a democracy, starting banning political parties. But the thing is that Europe is definitely isolated from Russia, and Europe not having natural resources that can support economic development, Europe will always be dependent on someone. It used to be dependent on Russia, which in fact worked even during the Cold War, because Russia never used this dependency on energy as a leverage to modify the policies within Europe. Whereas the US is doing that. Now, Europe has cut itself from Russia, and now they start to be dependent on the US. But the US works in favor of its own interests, and they will certainly not do favors to Europe. So that must be clear. Russia, on its side, has understood, and they have already at the end of 2022, they said they understood that all the ties with Europe were cut, and they understood that there were still some ties remaining because of some energy. I mean, Europe is still importing directly or indirectly Russian energy, but more and more this will be cut. And Russia has understood that its future is connected or related to Asia, India, Central Asia, and of course China. And they can forget about Europe. So, meaning that we are entering a phase in which Europe will be on its own, more and more on its own, with a very strong dependency on everything that is related to natural resources, meaning that to bypass this dependency, some companies will have to relocate themselves, and that's exactly what we have seen with some car industries, Mercedes, BMW, and Volkswagen as well. They are relocating some production in China, for instance, the big enemy of the day, because they see that the future will be completely obstructed in Europe. So they have to relocate their production somewhere else, and they are going to China and probably other parts of in Brazil, for instance. So we are seeing this move. The same applies to semiconductors, because regardless of how you see China as a competitor, as an enemy, as whatever you want, the fact of the matter is that China remains and will remain for the years to come, will remains the main market for semiconductors, meaning that you can put every tariff, ban, or whatever you can do against China. The fact of the matter is that China remains the main market for your products. And that's exactly what the US semiconductors industry is discovering. That despite protectionist ideas that were initiated with Biden and that will continue, obviously, with Trump, despite this, the fact of the matter is that those companies cannot survive without the Chinese market. So we are in a very weird situation where the West at large, US on the one hand, Europe on the other hand, base its policy on ideology and feelings and not on reality. The only way for everybody to have a prosperous future is to cooperate with each other and to have a more, let's say, um, balanced approach to relationships. During the last 30 years, the West understood uh, China and probably other countries, but China in particular, as their own manufacturer to manufacture items. And they disregarded the ability of Chinese to develop themselves and develop their own research and development and to develop new products. So they considered that, in fact, China was a cheap manufacture area, and so they could live with that. So they could manufacture these things in China and then sell them in the West. And today we see that it's not exactly what happens. China has developed its own capabilities, its own research and development. In fact, China is now the country that produced the most patents in the world. So that means that they have a completely autonomous research and development. We see that many technologies that are required for the West are, in fact, in the East. You know, we see that with semiconductors. We see that with new technologies or productive production methods that are developed in China that are more cost efficient or cost effective, and therefore we had the competitive edge of China is developing faster than the West. And the West, because the West has spent a lot of times, I mean, we didn't develop much research and development in the past 30 years. We have waged a lot of wars. We spend a lot of money making war abroad. We considered that China was manufacturing items, so we didn't even paid a lot of efforts in research and development. While China, on the other hand, has devoted a lot of resources in research and development. And now we have this paying off. As a result, China has an advantage. Look at what happens with high speed railways, EVs, the technology of batteries and all that. All that is developing in China. And in Europe, we don't have any company that is even capable of competing with the Chinese, not in terms of quantity, but in terms of, let's say, qualitative or let's say technological solutions. So we see that the West, because of its kind of ideological approach to foreign relations, the West is more and more going to, let's say, go deeper, let's say, while the rest of the world is developing at faster pace. And that's exactly what we have seen in Russia. Russia, because of the sanctions, had to realize this because being constrained to do so, and it has adjusted very fast. And probably it has been able, because it had an emerging um, high-tech sector, it could probably adjust quicker than the West, that has not, or is probably more deeper, or let's say more traditional type of technological research and development than Russia. And that's the reason why Russia is able to develop very quicker than Europe. So we have definitely the center of gravity of technological development and probably even economic development that has been brutally moved from Western Europe to the East, Eurasia at large. That takes into both Russia. It's a triangle, probably Russia, China, and India. Even if probably India has some, it's not as mature as it is in China, but it will come. So we have this center of gravity moving decisively on the east, and the West is losing the grip on development. That's what we can see. And with the elite we have currently in the power in Europe, I don't see a major change in the coming year. That's a kind of a pessimistic approach, but I think it's a realistic approach. So that may push the West in more radical position, like have more tariffs and things like this. But tariff is a double-edged sword, because it will punish imports. But a lot of things we produce need import from China. And that's very clear with semiconductors and electrical vehicles. So if we put tariffs on imports, we will make a problem for our own production. So that will fare back on us. That's exactly what companies like Apple, Nvidia in the United States have seen with the tariffs that were imposed on semiconductors by the Biden administration. So, I don't see the maturity in the elite mindset in Europe, at least. I don't see any maturity to cope with this problem intelligently. We tend to go deeper into kind of ideological approach to the problem, and that's very obvious with the European Union. I mean, people like Ursula von der Leyen, they are not people who think. They are not people who are conceptually. Um, they don't have an intelligence that allow to develop concepts. They are people who they're ideologically motivated, period. So I don't expect a lot of positive development from that in the future. We can just hope that some people, the population in Europe, realize this and overthrow all that. I don't know. But I don't see any positive and constructive outcome with the current elites we have in Europe.
Thank you so much, Colonel, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.